Winter, 1692. A strange and terrifying scene unfolded in the small Puritan community of Salem Village, Massachusetts. A local minister's daughter and niece were seized by an invisible torment. Their bodies writhed in pain, dashed about erratically, and they screamed out bizarre words in a language no one could understand. Neighbors who gathered to pray over the girls were both astonished and fearful, as the children complained of unseen specters biting and pinching at their skin. It was not long after that other women in the village exhibited similar disturbing symptoms, launching objects across rooms and speaking in frenzied gibberish. The community was baffled. What kind of malevolent force could be afflicting these youngsters? The answer reached by the villagers would eventually plunge Salem into a nightmare. Witchcraft. Welcome, everybody. Good to meet anybody new coming here. If you have not yet clicked that subscribe button, I invite you to do so if you feel the need to. And the like button and leaving a comment certainly helps grease the wheels of the algorithm, so I do appreciate that. The video is kindly ad-free for its entire duration. Thank you to the kind contributions of those on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who were kind enough to check out the merch store. Now, all that being said and introductions out of the way, you certainly know what you're here for. Over the next hour, we'll spend our time together, and I believe by the end you'll have quite a grasp on what happened in this time period, without all the pageantry and fluffiness. So let's get straight to the facts. And the fact of the matter is this. To really understand the witch trials, you must first have a grasp of the Puritan worldview. They lived in a religious society that saw everyday life through a biblical lens. Everything came back to the book, and the Bible's injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," was taken quite literally. In fact, the Massachusetts legal code made witchcraft a capital crime. The Puritans firmly believed that Satan and his demons were real entities lurking around in the wilderness, ever watching and always plotting how they were going to infiltrate those God-loving communities. They were a people of God, settled in those which were once the devil's territories. In other words, having carved a pious colony out of the rugged North American wilderness, they expected spiritual attacks. Any inexplicable misfortune, a crop failing, a cow falling ill, a child's mysterious illness, they might easily attribute it to the devil's malice, or perhaps the secret work of witches in league with him. In Puritan theology, a witch was not a folk healer or a fortune teller, but rather someone believed to have been deliberately entered into a covenant with Satan, often signing the devil's book or renouncing God's covenant. In exchange for this treasonous act, the devil would grant the witch the ability to harm neighbors through supernatural means. Witchcraft was therefore both a terrible sin and a form of treason against the spiritual community. It invites the entire village to attack. Well, the people of Massachusetts had seen a few cases of witchcraft before 1692. For instance, there was one case in Boston in 1688 that involved afflicted children and an Irish washerwoman named Goody Glover, who was executed as a witch after Cotton Mather investigated her case. Such episodes reinforce the belief that the invisible world of demons was constantly at war with the visible world of the faithful. Mather wrote in 1693, and we will be using him quite a lot as a reference during this, that no reasonable person could doubt the existence of witches and evil spirits, warning that to disbelieve the devil was worse than diabolical. Thus, on the eve of the Salem outbreak, the community was primed to view any strange affliction or calamity as possible evidence of witchcraft and the devil's handiwork playing out right in front of them. But the witchcraft accusations did not come out of nowhere. They tended to appear in times of crisis or stress. Salem Village in 1692 was a community under multiple pressures, which made it fertile ground for a witchcraft panic. So before getting into all of that, and the particular events of that year, let's sketch out the social and political backdrop that sets the stage. What was Salem like at the time? Salem Village, today Danvers, Massachusetts, was a small agrarian community about 5 miles inland from the bustling port of Salem town. The village had been experiencing, bitter internal divisions. You see, the problem was for years residents were quarreling over land boundaries, road building, and of course the choice of minister. The village had finally gained the right to have its own congregation separate from Salem town, but consensus on ministers, well, that was hard to come by. In the late 1680s, the villagers hired Reverend Samuel Parris as their pastor, a Harvard-educated former merchant with a fire and brimstone preaching style. I suppose that was the style at the time. Parris proved to be quite polarizing. Some families, like the powerful Putnam family, supported him, while others resented his rigid demands for better salary and free firewood. Factional lines formed between the minister's supporters and opponents, and that fueled distrust among neighbors. This local discord was compounded by a more broad crisis. New England had recently been through a turbulent political upheaval. The colonial charter was revoked in 1684, and a new royally appointed government was established in 1692, which left communities in uncertainty. Furthermore, war on the frontier was raging. Settlers in Massachusetts faced attacks from French-allied Native Americans during King William's War, that is from 1689 to 97. Salem Village was home to refugees from northern towns devastated by these raids, bringing harrowing stories of massacres and war crimes. For instance, a young servant named Mercy Lewis had escaped an Indian attack in Maine that killed her parents, and she now lived in Salem Village, understandably quite traumatized by the experience. Well, it can be argued that the frontier war's orphans and refugees like Mercy carried psychological scars that primed them to see the devil's hand in New England's woes. Perhaps. Either way, such conditions created an atmosphere of intense anxiety. Threats to the community's safety and soul seemed to loom everywhere, be it Catholic French or heathen natives on the frontier, or just the devil himself and his presumed agents, and they could be in the room next to you. Early in 1692, this fearful atmosphere meant that a sudden outbreak of bizarre behavior would not be met with calm reason, but with a dread and readiness to find the quickest scapegoat available. In January 1692, the minister Samuel Parris's household became the unlikely epicenter of a bizarre movement. Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty Parris, and 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to experience mysterious fits. According to witnesses, the girls would scream out blasphemy, contort their bodies into impossible positions, cower under chairs or behind furniture, and complain of being pricked and pinched. Well, the local physician really had no idea what to do. He couldn't explain these symptoms, and he allegedly concluded that the girls were suffering from the, quote, evil hand, i.e., witchcraft affliction. Weeks went by. Other girls and young women in Salem Village exhibited similar symptoms. 12-year-old Anne Putnam, Jr., the daughter of Parris's chief supporter, Thomas Putnam, reported frightful apparitions. Soon, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and a few others had joined this group of afflicted girls, all suffering bouts of torment. The community was alarmed and puzzled. The prevailing question was clear. If this was witchcraft, which they had already decided, who was the cause of these torments? Under increasing pressure from the adults, the afflicted girls eventually began to name individuals that they believed were bewitching them. In late February 1692, the finger was pointed at 3 women, the easiest targets in the community: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Now, Tituba was the enslaved housekeeper in the Parris household, of Caribbean or African origin, and she was known to tell stories of magic to the girls. Sarah Good, she was a destitute, pregnant mother who begged door to door, but was still despised for her sharp tongue and disheveled appearance. As for Sarah Osborne, she was an elderly, sickly woman who had scandalized neighbors by not attending church regularly and by pursuing her own economic interests, that is, trying to control her late husband's estate rather than cede it to her sons. These 3 women, a Caribbean slave, a beggar, and a quarrelsome old lady, fit the mold of the usual suspects for witchcraft in the eyes of the villagers. And so, on February 29th, warrants were issued for their arrest. The initial interrogation of Tituba, Good, and Osborne in March 1692 marks the formal beginning of the Salem witch crisis. The accused were brought before local magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, at the Salem Village meeting house, while the afflicted girls sat among the crowd. From the outset, the proceedings were charged and chaotic. As soon as the examination of Sarah Good began on March the 1st, the young accusers fell into fits in the meeting house, crying out that the specters of the accused were tormenting them right there and then. Magistrate Hawthorne questioned Good. "Why do you hurt these children?" And Good steadfastly replied, "I do not hurt them. I scorn it. I am falsely accused." She maintained her innocence, and even dared to chastise her accusers as liars, which only further convinced authorities of her wickedness. Sarah Osborne also denied all charges, befuddled by the wild and confusing claims against her. But Tituba, she responded quite differently. She actually confessed. And this is where it's interesting, because it was Tituba's confession that was really the bombshell that accelerated the witch hunt. Now, whether it was out of fear, coercion, or just a shrewd instinct for survival, Tituba told the magistrates a vivid story, and it confirmed everybody's worst suspicions. She claimed that a dark man, i.e., the devil, had come to her, shown her a devil's book with several names in it, and compelled her to sign it and serve him. She spoke of seeing spectral creatures, a great black dog, a red cat, a yellow bird, and a hog, of witches flying through the air on sticks. Importantly, she said that she was not alone in the devil's service. There were others in the community. She described a conspiracy of witches, some of whom she named or described quite obliquely, who were afflicting the girls and plotting further evil. Now this confession lent official credence to the reality of witches in Salem, but it also meant that no one felt safe. If multiple witches were on the loose, then anyone might be a target, and anyone might be a culprit. And so, in the wake of Tituba's testimony, the magistrates began issuing more arrest warrants. Salem braced itself as the witchcraft accusations spread beyond the initial 3 women. The early phase of the crisis had mainly ensnared society's marginals, but March of 1692 saw the circle of accusations widen to include the more upstanding and normal community members. One of the next accused was Martha Corey, a farmer's wife and full church member in Salem Village. Martha Corey had publicly expressed skepticism about the girls' claims, remarking that they might just be making the whole thing up. In response, the afflicted girls, including Ann Putnam Jr., accused Martha of bewitching them herself. Her examination on the 21st of March became a spectacle. Whenever she moved or spoke, the girls would fall into convulsions, as if puppeted by Martha's glance. Observers reported that if Martha Corey merely cast her eyes upon the girls, they would be struck down or bitten, displaying small bite marks on their arms. Such performances convinced the magistrates that Corey was indeed a witch with deadly power, and if a reputable churchgoer like her could be a witch, it seemed that anyone could. And so, by late March, the infection of the accusations leapt from Salem Village to neighboring communities. In the town of Topsfield, the unthinkable happened. Rebecca Nurse, a 70-year-old matriarch known for her piety and kindness, was accused of witchcraft. Shocked villagers signed petitions vouching for her character, but the momentum of suspicion was simply too strong. Ann Putnam Jr., among others, claimed Nurse's spectre appeared and harmed them, and even Nurse's sister, Sarah Cloyce, fell under suspicion after she stormed out of a sermon that condemned witchcraft, which was probably not a good way to make yourself not look like a witch, but hey, maybe she was just busy doing something else. Of course, more arrests followed. By the end of April 1692, around 24 people had already been accused and jailed, and that includes Dorothy Good, Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter. The case of little Dorothy Good illustrated just how far the hysteria had gone. The child, 4 years old, was interrogated and even accused of biting the accusers with her tiny teeth. She, too, was sent to prison. A toddler in chains. Believe it or not. Well, it seemed that no one was beyond the reach of suspicion. At this stage, and you could probably imagine that the social fabric of Salem Village was tearing itself apart. Long-standing grudges and local feuds bubbled up through the accusations. The Putnam family and their allies were prominent accusers, and many of those they had accused had been at odds with them over property or church matters. For example, The Putnams had engaged in land disputes with the family of Rebecca Nurse, and they had resentment towards other neighbors too. Well, historian Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum in Salem Possessed, 1974, famously mapped the village's accusations along factional lines, suggesting that the witch hunt provided an outlet for the old resentments in a community split between the Putnam faction and the rival Porter faction, one being more agrarian and traditional and pro-Parris, the other more mercantile, worldly, and anti-Parris. While interpersonal conflicts do not fully explain the trials, these divisions created an environment where accusations might flourish as expressions of panic or spite. Fear and opportunity combined. Afflicted accusers sometimes targeted those whose downfall would benefit them or their family. As the number of accused witches mounted, neighbors began to eye each other with a bit of terror. Hysteria took hold in the truest sense. People genuinely believed the devil was in their midst, and that anyone could be bewitched or be a witch themselves. It was not only the usual suspects or the socially marginal that found themselves accused. Criticism of the proceedings itself became risky. John Proctor, a well-respected farmer, was gutsy enough to openly voice the opinion that the afflicted girls were either deluded, mad, or just lying. He even threatened to whip the nonsense out of his servant Mary Warren when she started having fits. Soon, John Proctor and his pregnant wife Elizabeth Proctor were, surprise, surprise, accused of witchcraft. Mary Warren briefly recanted her accusations, admitting that the girls had been feigning some of the afflictions. She said the accusers, quote, did but dissemble, but under the intense pressure she reversed herself again and rejoined the accusers. Dissent against the trials was effectively silenced, as those who spoke up could be suspected of being in league with the devil, and that gets you locked up, or worse. And so by May of 1692, the jails in Salem town and surrounding areas were overflowing with accused witches. Over 100 people from Salem Village, Salem town, and other towns like Andover, Topsfield, Ipswich, Billerica had been caught up in this dragnet. The village meeting house had been the scene of inflammatory preliminary hearings, but now the legal process was about to intensify. The colony's new governor decided that these cases of witchcraft must be brought to proper trial. In May 1692, Governor William Phips arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony with a new charter and authority. Finding the province in the grip of a witchcraft panic, not the best of welcomes, Phips swiftly established a special court to handle the trials of accused witches. This was the Court of Oyer and Termine, meaning to hear and determine, formed specifically for Essex County's witchcraft cases. He appointed as chief judge his lieutenant governor, William Stoughton, a zealous and unquestioning believer in witchcraft. Joining Stoughton were local magistrates and officials, including John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, who had led the initial examinations, and others like Samuel Sewell, Peter Sargent, and Bartholomew Gedney. These men had the now daunting task of sorting through the thicket of accusations to determine who, if anyone, was truly guilty. Of course, one of the biggest issues the court faced was what kind of evidence was admissible and credible in a crime as invisible as witchcraft. The trials turned heavily on spectral evidence, testimony that the accuser person's spirit or spectre was seen doing harm, basically independent of their physical body. The afflicted girls insisted that they could see the spectres of witches tormenting them or others. Now, normally the English law required concrete evidence or eyewitnesses to an observable act, but what the Salem accusers offered were invisible proofs. Just he said, she said kind of thing. So many Puritan clergymen and jurists were uneasy about this situation. Could the devil impersonate an innocent person? If so, a victim might see the spectre of an innocent neighbor and be deceived. But influential voices argued that the devil could not take the form of a righteous person without that person's permission. Thus, if a spectre resembling somebody was afflicting the girls, that someone must be a witch who had to allow Satan to use their form. Reverend Deodat Lawson's sermon in Salem that March had reinforced this idea, asserting that the devil, only with a witch's consent, quote, will use their bodies and minds, shapes and representations, to affright and afflict others at his pleasure. Of course, this made the reasoning behind spectral sightings considered as evidence, and quite damning evidence at that. Now, the court of Oyer and Termine chose to accept spectral evidence as part of the prosecution. This decision only made things worse, fanning the flames of the hunt, since the afflicted could now effectively prove a charge by just saying, I see the apparition of so-and-so trying to stab me right now. And that was good enough evidence. So besides the spectral evidence, there were other types of evidence used against the accused. These included the so-called witch marks, unusual blemishes or growths on the body that were usually insensitive to touch, thought to actually be teats for the suckling demonic familiars. Examiners humiliated suspects with full-body searches for any mole or birthmark that could be interpreted as one left behind by the devil. The testimony of confessed witches was also used. Those who confessed to being witches sometimes named others as accomplices, and such accusations were, of course, eagerly followed up. Additionally, past incidences were dredged up as evidence of a suspect's witchcraft. If years before someone's neighbor's ox died after a quarrel, or a child got ill when the suspect cast a sidelong glance, these stories were retold in court to establish this pattern of maleficium, or harmful magic. Well, a particular dramatic form of spectral test was the so-called touch test. An afflicted person in the throes of a fit would suddenly go calm when touched by the accused witch. This was seen as proof that the accused was drawing back her spectre or evil influence. Such tests of dubious logic were nonetheless performed and taken seriously by magistrates. The trials also featured absurd episodes that revealed the bias in favor of the accusers. For example, during Sarah Good's examination, one of the afflicted claimed Good had stabbed her with a knife and produced a broken blade tip to prove it. But a young man in the crowd interrupted to explain that he had broken that very knife the day before, and the girl had witnessed it. Well, you'd think that they would punish the girl for faking evidence. But no, far from doing that, Judge Hawthorne simply told her to stick to the truth from now on, and encouraged her to continue with her testimony. No harm done. Well, such incidents certainly show the court had largely made up its mind already that witches were tormenting the community. Rather than searching for truth, they were just searching for confirmation of their own narrative. Some contemporaries were, of course, deeply troubled by the court's evidentiary standards. Increase Mather, the president of Harvard College and the father of Cotton Mather, wrote a treatise in late 1692 titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. In this work, he warned that a reliance on spectral evidence was not only unjust but dangerous. He writes in the work, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." A pretty bold critique, don't you think? Well, it was a bold critique of the trial's approach, coming from a respected Puritan minister nonetheless. Increase Mather and several other Boston clergymen urged the judges to require more substantial proof of witchcraft, such as voluntary confessions or tangible evidence, rather than the contested visions of teenage girls. However, during the peak of the hysteria in mid-1692, these cautionary voices did very little to check the clamor of the court. The judges, especially Stoughton, believed that they were doing God's work by purging the colony of a deadly spiritual threat. With spectral evidence and panic guiding them, they proceeded to convict and condemn. After weeks of preliminary hearings and jailings, the formal trials began in June 1692. The first to be tried by the court was Bridget Bishop, a woman in her 50s from Salem town. Bishop was an easy choice for the first case. Years before, she had been suspected of witchcraft, but never convicted, and she was known for her flamboyant style. She kept a tavern, she wore a bright red bodice, and quarreled often. On June the 2nd, 1692, Bishop's trial took place in Salem. The evidence against her was a mix of spectral claims and anecdotes. Several of the afflicted testified that Bishop's spectre had grievously hurt them, and neighbors recounted strange happenings. For example, like finding these dolls used in witchcraft in her house, and seeing the ghosts of dead people near her, which is not normal. Bishop maintained her innocence, however. The jury, well, they found her guilty. And so, on June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was taken to Gallows Hill in Salem, and as the name applies, she was hanged. That was the first execution of the Salem trials. But Bishop's execution did not do much to satiate the authorities. If anything, it just emboldened them. Through June into July, the court convened multiple sessions. Dozens of accused witches had been waiting in prison, so the trials proceeded rapidly. The court's method was consistent. The afflicted girls would dramatically accuse the prisoner in open court, often mimicking the prisoner's movements as if under her spell, while townspeople gave depositions about past mischiefs. The accused usually had very little effective defense. It was their word against the testimony of seemingly afflicted innocents and respected neighbors. Few lawyers were present. Defense counsel was not a standard right in that era, so most defendants just stood alone. Still, some resisted quite fiercely. Rebecca Nurse maintained her innocence with dignity and drew much public sympathy. In fact, when Nurse was initially tried in late June, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, unable to reconcile the saintly grandmother with the image of a witch. Upon hearing this unexpected verdict, The afflicted girls erupted in spasms, and the judges expressed dismay. The jury was instructed to reconsider a puzzling remark the nurse had made. She had misheard a question and given an odd response. So under pressure, the jury reversed its decision, and nurse was declared guilty. Her conviction and death sentence went forward, causing deep unease among many observers who felt that a godly woman was being wronged. July 19th, 1692, Rebecca Nurse was executed by hanging, alongside 4 other women accused of witchcraft: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. A ghastly spectacle. Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged the condemned to confess and save their souls. Sarah Good was defiant to the end. She famously responded, "You're a liar. I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take my life away, God will give you blood to drink." Her curse was remembered ominously in Salem. Reverend Noyes indeed died of a throat hemorrhage years later, which locals saw as the dark fulfillment of Good's prophecy. But you see, Good, she never confessed. As she stood at the gallows, she maintained her innocence. Her young daughter, Dorothy, remained imprisoned for months, and Good's newborn infant died in the fetid jail before Good was hanged. Personal tragedies. Makes it a bit more human, doesn't it? July was a busy month. Among the executions in July, Susanna Martin of Amesbury stood out for her dry wit, even under persecution. When accused by the hysterical girls of being a witch, she laughed and asked the court, "What ails these people? I have had no hand in witchcraft." This skepticism was not taken in good humor, rather taken as insolence, and she too was sent to the gallows. Elizabeth Howe and Sarah Wilds had been entangled in prior social conflicts. Howe had been accused by neighbors of bewitching a family member years before, and Wilds had a reputation for immodesty and gossip. Well, it all returned to haunt them in court through these old testimonies. Yet none of these women expected that a conviction and execution would actually befall them on such flimsy ground. Well, the witch hunt's momentum continued into August. The court reconvened and now targeted some of the most prominent figures accused. Martha Carrier of Andover, described by Cotton Mather as a, quote, rampant hag who aspired to be the queen of hell, was tried and condemned. Cotton Mather does not seem very keen on her. Well, more shocking to the public, though, was the trial of the Reverend George Burroughs, the former minister of Salem Village. You see, Burroughs had been brought back from Maine to face charges that he led the witch conspiracy. Witnesses claimed Burroughs possessed superhuman strength. One story told of him effortlessly carrying a heavy barrel or lifting a musket with a finger, suggesting that the devil aided him, and that he bewitched his past wives to death. The afflicted girls called him the Black Minister, in league with Satan. Burroughs mounted a strong defense, denying all charges and even reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly on the gallows, something that witches were thought to be incapable of doing. For a moment, the assembled crowd was moved and unsure about his guilt. But Cotton Mather, present on horseback, intervened to remind the onlookers that the devil could masquerade as an angel of light, and that a witch could indeed recite scripture if so permitted, And with that, the execution proceeded. August 19th, 1692, George Burroughs was hanged on Gallows Hill, along with Martha Carrier, John Proctor, John Willard, and George Jacobs Sr. 5 souls, 1 day. John Proctor died after vainly writing letters from jail urging Boston's ministers to intervene. Willard, a former constable who had shown reluctance in arresting suspects, was accused likely out of spite. George Jacobs Sr. was an elderly man, betrayed by the testimony of his own granddaughter. She had been pressured into confessing and accusing others to save herself. The pattern was clear, though. Even high status or prior respectability offered no protection once the machinery of the accusations labeled someone as such. Well, the last round of the trials took place in September of 1692, pushing the death toll even higher. In early September, the court convicted several more individuals of witchcraft, including Martha Corey, that is Giles Corey's wife, Mary Easty, another one of Rebecca Nurse's sisters. Mary Easty had initially been released after her preliminary hearing because the evidence against her was, well, practically, there was no evidence, weak at the best of times. But the afflicted girls protested with renewed fits until she was rearrested. Before her execution, Easty wrote a moving petition to the court, pleading for an end to the mass arrests and cautioning them not to shed any more innocent blood. Well, I don't think they really read too much into that letter. On September 22nd, 1692, 8 convicted witches were taken by cart to the gallows and executed. Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Anne Puditor, Wilmot Red, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. Now Wardwell, he was a man from Andover who had initially confessed to witchcraft to save himself, but then later recanted. But by then, the court was unsympathetic, and he was condemned largely for daring to retract his own confession. With these final executions, the count of the dead reached 20. 14 women and 6 men had lost their lives. But there is one method that was not yet mentioned, and that is, well, one that remains quite singular in American history, and that is pressing. The pressing of Giles Corey stands as probably one of the most ghastly episodes of the trials. He was an 80-year-old man, the husband of Martha Corey. After Martha's arrest in the spring, Giles himself was accused of witchcraft, partly due to a confession by another accused, and partly because he had made the mistake of speaking out against the legitimacy of the proceedings. By September, he realized that a trial would certainly end in his conviction. Every person who had pleaded innocent up to that point had been found guilty by the court. In an act of stubborn defiance, he refused to enter a plea at his own trial, standing completely silent. According to English law, a defendant who stood mute could not be tried, but the court could administer a gruesome penalty, pressing the person with heavy weights to coerce a plea. Even though this practice was technically against the Massachusetts law code, the Salem judges imposed it. And so Giles Corey was stripped naked, and heavy stones or iron weights were piled on him as he lay in a pit next to Salem jail. He endured this torture for 2 days. When urged to relent and enter a plea, the old man only gasped out, "More weight." Those were said to be his last words. He was literally crushed to death, September 19th, 1692, chest broken through. So brutal was this scene that it helped turn public opinion against the trials. Many in the community were, well, frankly, horrified such an execution was carried out. Giles Corey's defiance also resonated through history as a symbol of principled resistance to unjust authority. One of the unsung heroes, I suppose. More weight. Autumn, 1692. Finally, the frenzy in Salem began to abate. A combination of factors brought the trials to a halt. For one, the pool of new accusations was drying up, and some of the afflicted girls were starting to face increased skepticism. But importantly, the wider public and leaders in Boston grew alarmed at how far things had gone. The accusations had spread beyond Salem Village and even touched prominent families. The wife of Governor Phipps herself was rumored to be on the list of those suspected, which may have been the last straw. In October 1692, Governor William Phipps intervened and suspended the court of Oyer and Termine, effectively stopping the hangings. He heeded the advice of Increase Mather and other ministers who became critical of the trials, and later wrote to officials in London that when he returned from an expedition and found the situation in Salem, he put a stop to all proceedings to prevent the persecution of innocents. A letter to the Earl of Nottingham, October 1692. The tribunal was replaced with a new superior court of judicature, which would not allow spectral evidence. In January 1693, this new court convened in Salem to handle the remaining witchcraft cases. With no spectral evidence admissible, the atmosphere of the trials shifted significantly. Of the nearly 50 people still in custody waiting trial, most were quickly acquitted or just had their charges dropped. A few that were convicted, despite the stricter standards, were spared by immediate reprieves from Governor Phipps himself. And by May 1693, Phipps pardoned all of those who were still imprisoned on witchcraft charges. At last, the Salem witch hunt was over. In total, 20 people had been executed, and at least 5 more, including 2 infants, had died in custody. Many others survived, but had their lives shattered, farms left untended, reputations ruined, and of course the families grieving the unjust loss. Of course, in the wake of all this, people had to come to terms with what had occurred. The colony's leaders and citizens engaged in an uncomfortable process of repentance and reflection. In January of 1697, 4 years after the hangings, a public day of fasting and soul-searching was ordered. On that day, one of the former judges of the court, Samuel Sewell, rose in Boston's South Church, while a statement acknowledging his personal guilt was read aloud. Sewell accepted the blame and the shame for his part in the tragedy, an extraordinary admission from a man who had condemned innocents to death. The others were not so forthcoming. William Stoughton, the chief judge, never admitted he was wrong. He died in 1701, still very much convinced that he had done God's work. And the minister, Samuel Parris, whose household had sparked the initial accusations, was asked to leave Salem in 1697 as the congregation tried to heal its rifts. Parris eventually moved away, but perhaps he never fully escaped that reputation. One of the afflicted girls, Anne Putnam Jr., would later make the most notable apology. In 1706, as a 26-year-old, she publicly confessed error when she sought membership in the Salem Village Church. She acknowledged that Satan had deluded her, and she asked for forgiveness and declared her desire to lie in the dust in penitence. Though she had truly believed at the time she was doing God's will, she admitted she had been an instrument of evil in accusing innocent neighbors. The congregation accepted her confession. Notably, Anne Putnam Jr. was the only one of the core group of accusers to ever make such a public retraction. Well, in the following decades, the Salem community and the Massachusetts government slowly took steps to provide some kind of restitution and clear the names of the condemned. In 1711, the colonial legislature passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of many of the accused, and it awarded financial compensation to the surviving family members, though money hardly makes up for what happens. Well, the scars on the community, they would last a lot longer. Families of the victims harbored bitterness. Some left Salem altogether to start anew. Some stayed. The story of Salem's witch trials was seared into the conscience of New England as a grim cautionary tale of societal failure. And since the trials had become synonymous with the dangers of mass hysteria and the dark side of communal zeal, for the Puritans in 1692, the episode was initially seen as a battle with the devil that just got tragically out of hand. But not long after, it served as an example of why spectral evidence should never be used in court, and why due process and restraint are vital even during a crisis. When Cotton Mather published his account, Wonders of the Invisible World, in late 1692, he defended the trials as justified and providential. However, by 1700, Bostonian writer Robert Califf published more Wonders of the Invisible World, which scathingly criticized the trial's conduct and the credulity of men like Mathers. Califf accused the judges and accusers of bloodlust and delusion. His work reflected this growing colonial consensus that the witch hunt had indeed been a terrible, terrible mistake. Indeed, never again would American courts execute someone for witchcraft. The crisis in Salem was the last of its kind for the colonies. Although rooted in a very specific time and context, a Puritan society steeped in a literal belief in the devil and beset by hardships, the trial's legacy echoed far beyond 17th century Massachusetts. That very term, witch hunt, it endures in our language to describe irrational and unjust persecutions. Generations of scholars have studied Salem to understand how communal fear can lead ordinary people to participate in extraordinary injustice. The trials also prompted early thoughts about the rights of the accused and the limits on admissible evidence, a foreshadowing of the principles that became fundamental in American law. In Salem itself, the memory of 1692 remained sensitive. It was only in 1752 that Salem Village changed its name to Danvers, partly to disassociate from the taint of the witch trials. Yet, the fascination endures. The story continues to be retold in books, films, YouTube videos like this. It compels one to ask how an upright, devout community could turn so fiercely upon itself. Maybe that was the devil's plan all along. Who knows? That's another theory. But maybe the ultimate lesson is the importance of tempering fear with reason and ensuring that due process is not trampled over by hysteria. Well, the witch hunts have ended, but they left a legacy of sorrow, reflection, and a cautionary tale that still speaks to people over 3 centuries later. A morbid fascination. After all, that's why you're here, isn't it? Well, everybody, we reached the end of another video. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I've been having some trouble with my voice lately because I've been getting over a cold. But I hope you didn't notice any dip in quality. Now, you didn't notice any ads either, didn't you? So I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gugu Bubonic. Thank you so much. And once again, another thank you, because why not? It's been a pleasure. A cautionary tale. Good night, everyone. As always, lots of love to you all, and I will see you when you feel like coming back. You know where I'll be. Good night.